I was pushed out of my son's home and forced to face life alone. Losing everything taught me how silence can erase you and how speaking up can save you. This journey of pain, dignity, and boundaries became my truth and why I share it now as one of those inspirational stories, hoping it becomes part of your inspirational stories too. Before we go on, if you still believe in your heart that God is watching over you, always working things out in ways you can't see, then right now, drop an amen in the comments. Because who knows? The moment you write it, a blessing might be slipping quietly into your life. Now, then, let's get back to the story. My name is Renee Walker. I used to think that after all those years of being a single mother raising my son in the ever shifting south side of Chicago, I had reached the part of life where I could finally breathe a little easier. I never expected repayment. All I wanted was to be close to my child, to see him living more peacefully than I ever did. When my son, Darius, called and said that he and his wife needed someone to stay with them for a while, just temporarily, I didn't hesitate. He said his wife's job was stressful. The house was a mess. They were expecting a baby. And like I always had in my life, I chose to step forward. Their house was in a newly developed suburb west of the city. Light brick, a neatly trimmed front yard, everything looking very proper. I remember standing at the door a few seconds longer than necessary, telling myself, this is my son's home. I belong here. At first, things went smoothly enough. I woke up early habit. I made breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry. I did the things I had done my whole life, not because anyone asked, but because that was how I showed care. Darius's wife, Melanie, thanked me the first few times. Her voice was polite, but distant, as if I were a service being tried out. I told myself, it's okay. Everyone needs time. But after just a few weeks, I started noticing small changes. Melanie stopped saying thank you. She began correcting me in front of others. That's not very sanitary, Mom. You use too much salt. We're used to doing things differently here. She never raised her voice. The words were delivered softly, almost courteously, and that's what made them hard to push back against. I became more careful. I asked before doing anything. I rewashed dishes that were already clean. I quietly removed myself from the living room when they watched TV, even though I lived there too. I didn't want to cause trouble. I had lived my whole life by that rule. And Darius? My son still hugged me every morning, still asked if I was tired, but he avoided the uncomfortable moments. When Melanie said something that left me silent, he pretended not to hear. When I tried to speak to him privately, he said, later, Mom, later never came. I started to feel like a piece of furniture placed in the wrong spot inside a house arranged too perfectly. No one told me I had to leave. No one said I wasn't welcome. But everything in that space, the looks, the way their voices dropped when they talked about me, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, reminded me that I was only being allowed to exist there, not truly belong. One evening, I accidentally overheard Melanie on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't know I was in the laundry room behind it. I didn't expect living with a mother-in-law to be this exhausting, she said. It always feels like someone's watching me, like I have to behave the right way. I stood still. The washing machine hummed. My heart did not. That night, I didn't eat with them. I said I was tired. The truth was, I didn't want to see my own reflection in that kitchen anymore. From then on, things slid downhill faster. Melanie began dividing up space very clearly. This room is for our work. That shelf is for my things. Mom, just leave your shoes over there. Short, firm sentences. No anger. Just boundaries being drawn more and more clearly. I slowly shrank my life into the small bedroom at the end of the hall. I kept wondering where I had gone wrong. Had I come too soon? Stayed too long? Loved my son in a way that no longer fit the life he had built? One afternoon, as I was wiping down the kitchen table, Melanie walked in. She looked at me, then at the cloth in my hand. You don't have to do all that, she said. Her voice wasn't angry. But it made me stop. I'm used to it, I replied. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. I just want our home to be tidy in our way. I nodded. I put the cloth down. I went back to my room. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about the small apartment I used to rent when Darius was little. Thought about simple dinners, real laughter. I wondered when family started needing to be done the right way in order to be accepted. I didn't know yet that all of it, the silence, the invisible boundaries, the feeling of being made smaller, was only the beginning. That I was about to learn a painful lesson. Being pushed out of a family doesn't always start with shouting. More often, it starts with you slowly disappearing while you are still there. I can't point to the exact day everything shifted. There was no clear moment, no big argument. Just after weeks of living in that constant state of having to move softly, speak gently, I started to realize something. My presence was making someone uncomfortable. And when a person stays uncomfortable long enough, they start looking for a way to remove the source of it. Melanie changed the way she spoke to me. No more half-polite corrections. Her words became more direct, shorter, colder. The requests came out like orders, even though they were still wrapped in a polite tone. Renee, remember to park in the back. Renee, I don't like that smell of seasoning in the kitchen, Renee. Next time, let me know before you use the living room. I thought if I made myself soft enough, things would lose their edge. I was wrong. One afternoon, Darius was working late, and it was just me and Melanie in the house. Not because anyone needed it, but because I needed that familiarity. Melanie walked into the kitchen, leaned against the island, and watched me for a long moment. I turned and smiled. It's still early. I'm used to it. She exhaled, not loud, but enough for me to hear. Honestly, I don't like the feeling of always having someone else deciding things in my own home. I set the spoon down. What do you mean? Melanie crossed her arms. I think it's time you started thinking about another plan. Darius told me you were only here temporarily. I don't remember how long I stood there. I just remember feeling like I'd been pushed out of something I couldn't see. He never said that to me. I said, that's because you've been acting like you can stay as long as you want. She replied, but this is our home. She didn't need to raise her voice. The sentence stood on its own and closed the door behind me. That night, I waited for Darius to come home. I sat at the kitchen table, didn't eat, didn't turn on the TV. When my son walked in, I looked at him for a long time, like I was trying to recognize the child I once held in my arms. Darius, I said, is there something you want to say to me? He took off his shoes, wouldn't meet my eyes. What's wrong, Mom? I told him about the conversation. No exaggeration. No missing pieces. I waited. I waited for him to say, that's not true, Mom. I waited for denial. Darius was quiet for a long time. Melanie's under a lot of stress. He finally said, she's pregnant. You know that, and what about me? I asked. Am I not under stress? He sighed. Mom, don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. That's when I understood. His silence wasn't because he didn't know what to say. It was because he had already chosen not to stand with me. After that, the house grew heavy. Melanie avoided me completely. I could hear them talking in low voices in their bedroom, the door half closed. Once, I heard my name, followed by a short, broken laugh. I started preparing myself to leave, even though no one had said it outright. I packed slowly, piece by piece, as if stretching time might dull the pain. Then it happened. On a rainy morning, I was in the laundry room in the back when I heard Melanie call out from the kitchen. I walked in, my hands still wet. She pointed at the floor. Did you spill coffee? But I didn't get the chance to explain. How many times have I said this? She snapped. You need to be more careful. It wasn't me. I started. Suddenly, Melanie slammed the cup in her hand down into the sink. The sharp crack made me jump. I'm tired, she said. Tired of having to remind you of things like, you're a child. I froze. And that was when Darius walked in. I looked at my son. This was the moment, the only moment. You heard that, I said, my voice shaking but steady. Are you going to say anything? Darius looked at the broken cup, looked at Melanie, then looked at me. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Maybe you should take a few days away, he said. Give everyone some space to calm down. I heard the rain hitting the windows. I heard my heartbeat, and I understood. Melanie turned away. Darius wouldn't look at me. No one said, you need to leave, but everything in that house was pushing me toward the door. I went into my room and pulled out my suitcase. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't zip it closed. I waited. I was still waiting for someone to call my name, to stop me. Nothing. When I stepped into the hallway, Darius was standing there. I'll call you, he said. When things settled down, I nodded. Outside, the door closed behind me softly. Under the porch, the rain kept falling. I stood there for a few seconds, not knowing where to go. One sentence kept repeating in my head. I have just been removed by my own family. I didn't know then that moment dragging my suitcase through the rain wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would force everyone who ever saw me as a burden to look at me in a completely different way. I don't remember how long I walked after leaving Darius's house. I only remember the steady, cold rain and the suitcase rattling behind me clack, clack like a constant reminder. You are being pushed out of your own child's life. I stood at the nearest bus stop, watching cars pass, not knowing which bus I was supposed to get on. I had an old phone with a weak battery and a wallet so thin I could feel every bill when I touched it. I called Darius once, right there at the stop, just to see if he had changed his mind. It rang. I didn't call a second time. I took a bus toward downtown, toward the area where I had worked years ago. I thought I might stop by someone's place, but as the bus rolled through familiar streets, I realized I no longer had someone in that sense. Everyone who had once been close to me had moved away, lost touch, or passed the point in life where they still had the energy to carry someone else. I got off in an area with cheap motels, flickering neon signs, red and blue lights, reflecting in puddles. I walked into the front desk of a place called the Hawthorne Inn, a name that sounded better than the reality. The man behind the counter looked me up and down, then at my suitcase. One night, I said. My voice was rough from the cold. He gave me the price. I swallowed. It was more than I expected, but less than anywhere else. I handed him my card. The machine declined it. I tried again. Declined. Cash, he asked. Impatient. I counted my money. I could pay for one night and almost nothing after that. My room was on the ground floor. The door opened with a heavy metal key. The hallway smelled like bleach mixed with old dampness. Inside the room was a bed with yellowed white sheets, a small TV mounted on the wall, and an air conditioner that rattled like it had a cough. I set my suitcase down, sat on the bed, and for the first time that day, I let myself breathe. I thought I would cry, but the tears didn't come. There was only a frightening emptiness, like my mind had shut itself down to conserve energy. That night, I slept in fragments. Every footstep in the hallway startled me awake. I thought about Melanie, about Darius, about the way my son had said just a few days. A few days. With whom? Where? With what money? The next morning, I bought a cheap cup of coffee and a small roll. I sat on a bus, watching the city slide by, and started making a list of what I could do. Find temporary work, call an old friend, apply for social assistance. Things that sound very reasonable when you still have a roof. Once you don't, they turn into a maze. I went to the county community services office. A long line. Silent. Wet coats. Faces that didn't look at one another. I stood there holding my number, and for the first time, I felt like I was stepping into a world I had only ever seen on television. Until it was. When it was my turn, The caseworker asked me everything: address, income, family, health status. I answered. I told the truth. And each answer felt like another layer of dignity being peeled away. Do you have family? She asked. I paused for a second. I did. I had a son. He lived in a house with a tidy front yard. He ate warm dinners. He had a wife. He had a life. I can't stay with them, I said finally. She looked at me with the familiar expression of someone who had heard that sentence too many times. She handed me a sheet of paper: shelter lists, meal times, support phone numbers, black text on white paper. Calm to the point of cruelty. I went back to the motel in the late afternoon. The man at the desk looked at me like I'd already become a regular after one night. Pay up front, he said. I opened my wallet. What was left wasn't enough. Can I pay part of it? I asked. I'll make up the rest. He shrugged. No. I stood there, heat rushing to my face with shame. I wanted to say, I'm not that kind of person. But what kind of person is that? Someone without enough money? Someone who's been pushed out? Someone with nowhere to go? I pulled my suitcase out of the motel again. This time, it wasn't raining. That evening, I went to a small church in Bronzeville. I remembered passing it when I was younger. I walked in and sat in the back pew. No one asked who I was. No one stared. An older woman came over, handed me a cup of water, and said, Are you okay? I wanted to say, I'm fine. I always said, I'm fine. But this time, my throat closed. I nodded. I didn't want to cry in front of a stranger, but I learned something then. Sometimes the kindness of strangers hurts more, because it reminds you that the people who should have been kind weren't. That night, they gave me a temporary place to sleep in the fellowship hall. A thin mat, an old blanket, dim lights. I lay there listening to people breathing around me, someone coughing, someone mumbling in their sleep. I stared at the ceiling, and a question formed in my mind. One I didn't want to face. If I disappeared, would Darius notice? I used to think that question was hypothetical, a kind of emotional test. But when you're lying on a thin mat among strangers, it stops being a test. It becomes raw truth. The next morning, I left the church, stepped onto the street, and watched people heading to work. They carried coffee cups, bags, phones pressed to their ears. They passed me like I was a shadow. I stood on the corner with my suitcase and understood something. You can live among thousands of people and still be invisible. I tried calling Darius again. The phone rang, then stopped. I turned it off. I didn't want to hear his voice in a cold voicemail recording. I walked to a small park near the lake. I sat on a stone bench, looking at the gray water. I had no plan. Only time, the endless time of people who no longer have a schedule. And there, in that space where it felt like I had nothing left to lose, I began to remember something, an old detail, like a slip of paper forgotten in a drawer for years, a name, an address, a message I had once ignored because I thought, I won't need this. I didn't open it right away. I didn't dare. Part of me was afraid it was just the last illusion of someone with nowhere left to stand. But another part, the part I thought had died on that rainy night when I was pushed out, whispered, Renee, there is still one door. Thank y'all for sticking with us all the way to this point. If you busy or gotta go right now, hit that like button so you can find this video easy later. All right now, let's get back to the story. I sat in that park by the lake for almost an hour, doing nothing but staring at the piece of paper in my hand. It wasn't anything special, just a folded sheet, yellowed with age, the corners worn soft, with a name and an address written in blue ink: Harbor Community Credit Union, South Loop. I don't remember exactly when I tucked it away. Maybe years ago, back when I helped a friend co-sign a small loan for her shop. I only remember her saying, if one day you need a place that understands you better than the big banks, go here. I laughed back then. I thought I would never need it. I folded the paper again and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't go right away. I was afraid of hope. Hope is the thing that hurts you twice as much when it doesn't work out. But by late afternoon, not because I believed in anything for sure, but because I had no other option left. Harbor Community Credit Union was in an old 3-story building, red brick out front, nothing flashy. The glass doors were slightly cloudy. Inside were dark wooden counters and a few faded green plastic chairs. It didn't look like a place that stored miracles, but it had something I hadn't felt in weeks. The woman at the desk looked at me and smiled. A real smile. No measuring. No pity. "Hello. How can I help you?" I hesitated. I didn't even know what I was there for. I didn't have an account. I didn't have money. I. Someone once told me I could ask about an old file. I said, "My name is Renee Walker." She nodded and typed something into her computer. Then she looked up. "Were you part of a housing cooperative some years ago?" My heart started pounding. I remembered, not clearly, but enough to feel something shift inside my head. Years ago, when Darius was still small, I had joined a community program, a cooperative for working Black families, where people pooled small investments to hold shares in affordable rental properties. I had withdrawn when I needed money for my son's education. At least, that's what I thought. "I thought I took everything out," I said. She asked me to sit and disappeared into the back. I looked around. No one in the room paid attention to me. No one knew I'd slept on a thin mat in a church the night before. Here, I was just someone with a name, with a record. A middle-aged man came out and introduced himself as Mr. Caldwell, a financial advisor for the credit union. He didn't speak fast. He spoke slowly, clearly, like he knew people came here carrying fragile things. "Renee," he said, "you were one of the early members of East Harbor Homes Cooperative. You didn't withdraw everything. You kept your shares, and, according to our records, those shares have increased in value over time." I heard him, but I didn't quite understand. "Increased? How much?" I asked. He looked at me, as if choosing his words carefully so I wouldn't bolt from fear. "Enough that you don't have to sleep outside," he said. "But it's not liquid cash. It's equity, ownership, authority." My hands clenched. I thought about the rain, the suitcase, the way Darius wouldn't look at me. Authority. That was something I had lost a long time ago. He went on to explain. The cooperative had grown, restructured, and some properties had been placed into a community land trust. Long-term shareholders retained voting rights, profit participation, and, in certain cases, priority involvement in management decisions. "You never signed the final transfer documents," he said. "Legally, you're still part of it." I didn't smile. I just sat there and let the words settle. "There's one more thing," he added, his voice lower. "One of the properties in the trust is in the western suburbs. You might recognize the area." He turned the screen toward me. An address appeared. I didn't need to read closely. I knew it immediately. It was the same area where Darius was living. Not his house. Not directly, but part of the rental development where prices were kept below market, one of the perks he'd proudly told me about when they first moved in. My throat went dry, not from joy, from the precision of the irony. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Mr. Caldwell said. "You can simply know that you're not as invisible as you thought." Streetlights flicked on one by one. I walked slowly, as if moving too fast might make everything disappear. I didn't call Darius. I didn't think about Melanie. I thought about myself, something I hadn't done in years. That night, I didn't go back to the church. I found a small weekly rental room, not fancy, but with a lock, a window, and a table big enough to set my bag down. I paid the deposit with a small emergency advance from the cooperative fund, which Mr. Caldwell helped activate. When I set my suitcase down on the floor of that room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt upright. I stood in the bathroom and looked at my face under the yellow light. I saw exhaustion. I saw wrinkles. But I also saw something else. something I hadn't seen in a long time. Clarity. I understood then that the piece of paper wasn't a miracle. It didn't erase what I'd been through. It didn't turn Darius into a different son. It didn't make Melanie disappear. But it did something more important. It gave me my choices back. And when you have choices again, you start asking different questions. Not how much longer can I endure this, but what do I want to happen next? I didn't do anything yet. I didn't make calls. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't claim anything back. I let the truth rest inside me. Not drawn, but ready. Because I knew this much. The people who once saw me as a burden had no idea that the balance had already begun to shift. After my first night in that small rented room, I woke up very early. Not because of an alarm clock, but because my mind no longer allowed me to sleep peacefully. I made coffee with the old kettle the landlord had left, leaned against the windowsill, and looked down at the street still damp with morning mist. I realized something strange. Once you're no longer in panic mode, the things that used to scare you become very clear. I didn't call Darius. I didn't text. I didn't leave any sign that I was okay. I needed time. Not for revenge, but to understand the rules of the game. That morning, I went back to Harbor Community Credit Union, not as someone asking for help, but as someone asking for information. Mr. Caldwell met me in a small conference room in the back. On the table was a thin stack of documents, not intimidating, but enough to remind me that this world runs on paperwork, not tears. You have two options, he said. One, you step in directly. Two, you let the cooperative handle everything according to procedure, and you remain a shareholder only. I didn't answer right away. Does anyone know my name? I asked. He shook his head. Not unless you want them to. That sentence opened another door. Anonymity. No direct confrontation. No emotions tangled up in decisions. I chose the second option. In the days that followed, I settled into a new routine. Mornings were for reading documents, lease agreements, financial reports, community trust regulations. In the afternoons, I walked, so my mind wouldn't sink back into old patterns. At night, I wrote things down, not emotional journaling, but lists of facts. What I had, what I didn't, what I could do, and what would happen if I did nothing. I learned to separate myself from the role of mother when I thought things through. Every time Darius's face came into my mind, I asked myself, if this were not my son, how would I handle this? The answer was always clearer than I expected. 1 week passed, then two. During that time, the cooperative began reviewing long-standing lease agreements, a routine process clearly outlined in its bylaws. Certain incentives were adjusted to better match current market conditions. Nothing sudden, nothing shocking, just precise. I didn't need to ask to know that the area where Darius lived would be affected, not because I targeted it, but because it had been on the list from the beginning. One afternoon, as I sat in my room, my phone vibrated. Darius's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice tight. "I'm managing," I said. I wasn't lying. I just wasn't saying everything. "Melanie says the rent in our area is about to go up," he said. "Do you know anything about this?" I stayed quiet for a second, long enough for him to sense there was something I wasn't saying. "Are you asking me as my son?" I asked. "Or as a tenant?" On the other end, I heard him breathe sharply. "Why would you say that? Because those are two different questions," I said calmly, "and they come with two different answers." He didn't respond right away. "Do you know who's behind this?" he asked. I looked around my small room, the wooden table, the cold coffee, the closed window. The call ended in confusion. No argument, no raised voices, but something had shifted. In the days that followed, I heard through acquaintances that Melanie was complaining, that she didn't understand why things were suddenly harder, that they'd been living there for years. None of it came to me directly, but I knew it was there, like small ripples before a larger wind. I didn't feel pleased. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt clear. One evening, Mr. Caldwell called me. There may be a meeting with some of the tenants. He said, "You're not required to attend, but if you want to, you could." I looked back at my notes. I won't attend. Not because I was afraid, but because it wasn't time. I knew this much. If I stepped out too early, everything would turn into family emotion, where I could be pulled back into my old role. But if I let the facts move forward on their own, collide on their own. In the meantime, I started doing something else, something small, but important. I changed the way I looked at myself. I bought clothes that actually fit, not to impress anyone, but so I wouldn't feel like I was borrowing space in someone else's life. I fixed my hair, which I had let go for too long. I stood straighter when I walked. These changes didn't draw attention from anyone else, but they made me notice myself. Late one night, as I was writing, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. "Can you help us? We're really worried." I read the message 3 times, then I set the phone down. Not because I didn't love my son, but because I was learning not to let love turn me into a weakness. I replied an hour later, "I believe you'll find a way. Just like you once believed I would manage on my own." I don't know how Darius read that message, but I know what I sent with it. Something I had never sent before. A boundary. That night, I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat at the table, looking at the neatly organized documents. Things were beginning to take shape. Not a plan for revenge, but a path one where I was no longer the person being pushed away, but the one choosing when to step forward. I hadn't revealed myself. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't spoken the full truth. But I knew this. What was coming could not be undone. And this time, when I stepped into the room where everyone would be waiting for answers, I wouldn't walk in as someone asking to stay. I would walk in as someone who had learned how to stand in her rightful place. I knew the tension would escalate. I just didn't expect it to escalate that fast. By the 3rd week after the cooperative sent out the adjustment notices, my phone stopped being quiet. These weren't check-in calls. Not "Did you eat yet?" Not "Are you okay?" They were urgent, clipped calls, like I'd become a customer service line, a place to dump panic. Darius called early in the morning. I was standing at the sink, washing my coffee mug as if it were the only thing I still had control over. "Mom," he said. No greeting. "We got another notice." I didn't ask what notice right away. I let him keep talking. My son always talks the most when he's afraid. "They're asking us to resubmit income documents, and Melanie says if we don't qualify, the lease could be reconsidered." I watched the water run. I thought about the lines at the community services office, the questions about income, address, family status. Turns out, being scrutinized isn't reserved for poor people. It's for anyone who's gotten used to being favored. "That's procedure," I said. My voice was calmer than I expected. "Procedure," Darius snapped. "We've lived there for years." I stayed quiet. Years. He said it like the place belonged to him, like stability was something he was entitled to. "You can do exactly what they're asking," I said. "Then wait for the review." He hesitated. "Mom, do you know who's behind this? Who's making these decisions?" I closed my eyes for a second. It was the same question he'd asked before. This time, his voice carried something new: suspicion. He was starting to sense a thread pulling everything in my direction, even though he couldn't see it yet. "Why do you think I would know?" I asked. "Because..." He paused, then exhaled hard. "Because you disappeared right when all of this started." I looked around the rented room. I looked at the suitcase, still sitting in the corner, never once out of my sight. "No, Darius, I didn't disappear. I was pushed out. You just didn't look." "I don't have anything else to say," I said. "Handle it." I hung up before my hand could start shaking. That same day, I got an email from Mr. Caldwell. The subject line was simple: Escalation. One word, but enough to tighten my chest. Some tenants were reacting strongly. Complaints were being filed, demands to meet management directly. And among the names listed was one I already knew would appear: Melanie Carter Walker. I read every line like I was reading a report on my own life. Melanie wrote that they were being treated unfairly, that they had contributed to the community, that they deserved special consideration. She used polished, careful language, the kind people use when they want to dress their needs up as principle. At the bottom of the email was one sentence that made me put my phone down. "We are requesting a direct meeting. We do not wish to deal with anonymous parties." I laughed, but there was no joy in it. Anonymous. If she knew how invisible I had once been, she wouldn't use that word like an insult. That evening, I went out walking to clear my head. I passed streets I didn't recognize, storefront lights spilling onto the sidewalk. I heard laughter from a bar, music leaking out. Part of me wanted to go inside, just to prove I still belonged to the world of normal people, but I didn't. I kept walking. I stopped at a small grocery store and bought bread and a can of soup. As I stood at the checkout, I heard a voice so familiar it sent a chill up my spine. Darius stood there, a few steps away. His jacket was damp from light rain, his hair messy, his eyes red like someone who hadn't slept. And next to him, Melanie. She looked at me like I wasn't supposed to exist here, like I'd broken the script she'd already written in her head. The mother-in-law is gone. The story is over. I didn't know whether they'd followed me or if it was coincidence, but the look in Melanie's eyes said it wasn't chance. "I've been looking for you all day," Darius said. "You didn't answer my texts." I looked at him. I looked at the way his hand gripped the grocery bag handle too tightly. I saw the panic in that gesture. Not panic about losing his mother, but panic about losing what he was standing on. Melanie stepped forward, her voice sweet but sharp. "Renee, what luck running into you." She glanced around, as if afraid someone might hear. "We need to talk." Right now, I felt the store keep moving around us, but in my head, everything went silent. I could hear my blood rushing. "Talk about what I asked." "The paperwork," Melanie said. "The rent situation. About someone making things difficult for us." "And what does that have to do with me?" I asked, quietly but clearly. Melanie gave a small smile. "You know, this all started right after you left. It's hard not to connect the dots." Darius looked at me, pleading. "Mom, if you know something, just tell me. We can't take much more of this." "Melanie's pregnant." The word pregnant was dropped like an old key one that used to open every door in my heart. I swallowed. I felt two versions of myself pulling in opposite directions. The mother and the woman who had slept on a church mat, been pushed out, stood alone in the rain with a suitcase. Melanie kept going. "If you're angry at us, you can say it, but don't play these indirect games." I looked at her. I remembered her eyes in the kitchen, the boundary drawing comments, the way she said, "This is our home," and I remembered Darius standing still. In that moment, I knew this was a crossroads. If I told the truth right then, told them about my stake, my knowledge, what was happening, I would step into the light too early. Everything would turn into an emotional family war. Control would slip from my hands. But if I stayed silent, I would have to watch my son drown in fear and watch Melanie use that fear to cast herself as the victim. I took a slow, deep breath and looked straight at Darius. "Are you asking me," I said, "or are you afraid of losing your home?" Darius opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Melanie cut in, her tone sharpening. "Renee, this isn't the time for drama. If you want something, just say it." I placed my groceries on the counter. I paid. I picked up the bag. I did everything slowly, like pace itself might stop me from saying what I wasn't ready to say. Then I turned back to them, standing between them under the store's white lights. "I'll say one thing," I said, low. "Don't come to me looking for shortcuts." Melanie narrowed her eyes. "What are you hiding?" I met her gaze, and for the first time, I didn't look away. "I'm learning not to rescue people who chose to abandon me," I said. Darius looked like he'd been slapped. Melanie went pale for a split second, then pulled herself back together. "So you admit you know something," she said. I didn't answer. I walked out. Behind me, I heard Darius call my name. I didn't turn around. I stepped into the light rain, my heart pounding hard enough to shake my ribs. I hadn't revealed everything, but I wasn't fully hidden anymore. And I knew this. From the moment Melanie saw me in real life, not as the live-in mother-in-law, but as a woman who could disappear and stand back up on her own, she wouldn't let this go quietly. That night, I returned to my room, closed the door, and leaned against it. Because I had just stepped up to the edge of the truth, and I could feel it clearly now. The real storm had only just begun. The community meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, not a courthouse, not a hearing room, just the neighborhood common room, the kind of place where people usually argue about trash bins, parking spots, and trees that need trimming. But I knew that for some people, that night would feel like the first trial of their lives. Mr. Caldwell called me that morning. "They're demanding that a shareholder representative be present," he said. "There's a lot of pressure. Local media has been invited." I hung up and sat there for a long time. I looked at the clothes hanging on the edge of the closet, still simple pieces I'd bought so I wouldn't feel like I was borrowing space. I chose a navy blue dress. Not loud, not hiding, a color steady enough to stand under bright lights without shaking. I knew that if I walked into that room, I would no longer be anonymous. But if I didn't walk in, the story would be told without me by people who were used to defining me as a burden. The common room was right inside the complex. Bright fluorescent lights, folding chairs in rows, a small podium with a microphone at the front. I arrived early and took a seat in the very back, near the exit. An old habit always, keep a way out. People started filing in. Familiar faces, new ones, older residents, young families, a few clutching thick folders, as if paperwork could shield them from fear. Then I saw Darius and Melanie. They walked in together, but not close. Darius scanned the room like he was looking for someone. Melanie held her chin high, eyes already sharpened for battle. When she spotted me in the back row, her gaze froze for exactly 1 second. One very short second. But I saw it clearly. She hadn't expected me to be there. The meeting opened with routine formalities. Then came the section labeled Resident Comments. She spoke smoothly. She talked about instability, about families being affected, about cold decisions made by anonymous entities. She spoke as if she were representing everyone, those who hadn't been consulted. I stayed still. I listened. I recognized how skilled she was at turning her own fear into a collective one. When it was Darius's turn, he rose more slowly. His voice wavered. He talked about the baby on the way, about the need for stability, about having lived there long enough to deserve special consideration. I clenched my hands. Special. The word echoed in my head, colliding with memories I'd tried to pack away. Every time I asked to stay just a little longer, every time I told myself I needed to know my place. Others spoke too. Some agreed. Some pushed back. Then the moderator asked, would the shareholder representative like to speak? Mr. Caldwell stood. He spoke calmly, explaining procedures, bylaws, the reasons for the review. He was accurate. But accuracy alone wasn't enough. I could see that in people's eyes. A voice from the middle rows called out, "We want to know who's really behind this." Another followed. "These decisions affect real lives." The room buzzed, and I felt it, that moment when, if no one stepped in, the story would be steered somewhere else. I stood up. The scrape of my chair wasn't loud, but it was enough for the person beside me to turn. I stepped into the center aisle. I heard whispers. I saw Melanie spin around. I saw Darius freeze. "I'd like to speak," I said. My voice didn't shake the way I expected. The moderator nodded. The microphone was passed to me. I stood there under the harsh white lights. I didn't look at Darius. I looked at the room. "I didn't come here to ask for anyone's pity," I said, "and I didn't come to punish anyone." Melanie scoffed. I didn't look at her. "I'm here because I'm part of this story," I continued, "and I've been silent long enough." The room went still. "My name is Renee Walker." I said, "I'm a long-term shareholder in this community fund. And before I was a shareholder, I was a mother. A woman who's lived long enough to know the difference between stability and entitlement." The murmuring grew louder. I saw Darius raise a hand to his mouth. "I once lived in my son's home," I said. "And I left, not because I wanted to, but because I was made to understand I no longer belonged." Melanie jumped to her feet. "You're turning a private matter into—" "I haven't mentioned you." I cut in, my voice still low. "But if you recognize yourself in that story, perhaps you should ask why." A few sharp breaths. Several heads turned toward Melanie. "I'm not targeting any family," I went on. "These adjustments didn't start with resentment. They started with putting things back where they belong." I paused and let the silence do its work. "But I will say this clearly," I continued. "No one here is being treated worse than I was. And if we're going to talk about injustice, then let's talk about all of it." Melanie's face flushed. "Are you threatening us?" I turned to her for the first time. "No," I said, "I'm refusing to stay silent." Darius stood up. "Mom," I raised my hand. "You've had your chance to speak," I said. "Tonight, I'm finishing mine." The room was utterly quiet. "I'm not asking for special treatment," I concluded. "I'm asking for boundaries. And I believe this community is mature enough to tell the difference between legitimate rights and the fear of losing privilege." I set the microphone down. My hands were shaking then. The meeting continued. No final decisions were made that night, but I knew one thing for certain. The direction had changed. As people stood and filtered out, their eyes met mine differently. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with consideration. Darius waited for me at the door. "Was that worth it?" he asked, his voice rough. I looked at my son, this time, neither from above nor below. "Whether it was worth it," I said, "is a question you should have asked yourself a long time ago." Melanie said nothing. She avoided my eyes. But in the way she held Darius's hand, I could see something had cracked. I stepped outside and breathed in the night air. I didn't feel relieved. I felt alive. Because when other people have been telling your story for too long, speaking the truth isn't revenge. It's reclaiming your right to exist. And I knew this. What I'd just done wouldn't close the matter. It only opened the next chapter, one where pretending not to know would no longer be an option. Before we continue, please share your feelings in the comments. I want to hear your story. And if you feel this story resonates with you, please leave a like so I know you're still here with me until the very end. Now then, let's get back to the story. That night, I didn't go straight back to my rented room. I walked for a long time, as if the sound of my own footsteps could pull me out of that community room where every gaze still felt pressed against my chest. Cold wind slipped through my collar. I pulled my coat tighter, but the real chill didn't come from the weather. It came from a late realization. When you speak the truth out loud in front of people, there's nowhere left to hide from it. My phone kept vibrating. Texts, calls, unknown numbers, familiar ones. I didn't answer. I needed silence to put myself back together. Not as a shareholder, not as the subject of a meeting, but as me. The next morning, the local paper ran a short piece about the meeting. No dramatic headline, no judgment, just a few neutral lines about community debate and pending adjustments. But to me, it felt like a marker. This had moved beyond family. Mr. Caldwell called. "There's reaction," he said. "Nothing catastrophic." And possibly a formal complaint. I understand. I said, "Are you okay?" I paused. "I'm learning how to be." Around noon, I got a text from Darius. Just one line. "Can you meet with me?" Alone. I stared at the words for a long time. Before, a message like that would have sent me running. Now I asked myself, meet for what? To apologize? To demand explanations? Or to convince me to take back what I'd said? I replied an hour later. This afternoon, Lake Street Cafe. 4. I chose a public place. Not to perform, but to stay clear-headed. When I arrived, Darius was already there. He looked older than he had just weeks earlier, shoulders slumped, dark circles under his eyes. I sat across from him. No hug, no touch. I let the space speak. "I didn't expect you to do that," he said. "I didn't expect to be pushed out," I replied. He dropped his gaze. "You know, Melanie's pregnant." "I do," I said, "and I also know that doesn't give anyone the right to erase someone else." He looked up. "Do you know what I've had to listen to since that night? Melanie says you're trying to destroy our family." I met my son's eyes. "Families aren't destroyed by people who tell the truth." I said, "They crack when people choose silence over what's wrong." He went quiet. This time, silence didn't protect him. "So, what do you want me to do now?" he asked. "Undo everything." I shook my head no. "I want you to take responsibility for your part." "How?" "By not letting other people speak for you," I said, "and by understanding that your mother is not a cushion for everyone else to stand on." Darius exhaled hard. "I don't know where this is all going, neither do I said, "but I know I'm not going back to who I was." We didn't leave reconciled, but when I stood up, I saw something new in his eyes. Not remorse, but awareness. And sometimes, that's the only first step there is. That evening, an official email came in. A formal complaint had been filed. To win, or at least to drag me down with her. I sat at the table, reading every line. I wasn't afraid. I was just tired. My phone rang again. I answered. Renee, a woman's voice said, low and precise. "This is Janice Holloway. I represent several tenant households." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want?" "A conversation," she said, "not a threat, an understanding of where you're trying to go." I gave a small smile. "Then you're asking the right person." We met the next day at her office neutral ground, full of paperwork and the smell of cold coffee. Janice was direct. If tensions continued, the issue could be elevated to the city council level. There would be press. There would be pressure. "You could choose to de-escalate," she said, "or choose confrontation." "I'm not choosing confrontation." I said, "I'm choosing boundaries." She nodded. "Then you need to be ready for both outcomes." That night, back in my room, I sat in front of the mirror for a long time. I saw a woman who had moved through too many roles: mother, guest, invisible person, shareholder, spokesperson. I wondered how many layers I could carry before I forgot who I was underneath. Melanie texted, close to midnight, "You got what you wanted. But do you really think you've won?" I read it. I didn't respond right away. I didn't want this conversation to live on a screen. The next morning, "I'm not competing." I knew that would anger her. But I also knew her anger no longer had authority over me. The days that followed hung in suspension. No final ruling, no gavel, just meetings, emails, and the careful looks of a community trying to read which way the wind would turn. I learned how to live in the waiting without clinging, without running. One afternoon, I walked past the complex where Darius lived. I didn't go in. I stood across the street and watched lights turn on in apartment after apartment. I thought about the families inside, each carrying their own stories, their own fears. That's when I understood this wasn't only about me. But my reason for standing could only be one thing: not letting fear push me back into silence. That night, I received the schedule for the next meeting, this time with a higher council. A decision would be made. I folded the notice and set it on the table. Not to relive pain, but to shape the ending. And I understood this clearly. When a story reaches its final stretch, what matters isn't who wins, it's whether I'm still standing upright when it's over. The final meeting took place on a gray morning. No rain, no sunshine, just a neutral, colorless kind of weather, exactly like the way I felt inside. The meeting room was larger than the previous ones. A long table, microphones already set, lawyers, community representatives, and a few faces I had grown used to seeing over the past weeks. Everything followed procedure. No raised voices, no tears, no dramatic, movie-style climax. And that was what made it real. The decision was read in an even, steady voice. The adjustments would remain in place. No individual privileges, no punitive action either. Everything returned to where it belonged. Rules applied to everyone, without exception. I sat still. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt. Melanie didn't look at me. Darius did. My son's eyes were no longer panicked, no longer angry. They were empty, like someone trying to understand a world he had never prepared himself to face. After the meeting, people dispersed quickly. Polite handshakes, the usual, "We'll be in touch." I gathered my papers, slipped them into my bag, and walked out. No one followed me. And for the first time, that didn't hurt. I walked for a long while. I let the wind move through my hair. I thought about everything that had happened. From standing in the rain with my suitcase to standing at a microphone telling the truth. It had all happened so fast I hadn't fully realized how much I had changed. That evening, Darius called. "Mom," he said quietly. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied. "You just have to listen." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry for not protecting you." The words came late, but they came. I closed my eyes. I didn't cry. I also didn't feel the relief I thought I would. "Sorry doesn't erase what happened," I said, "but it tells me where you stand now, and that matters." "I want you to come back," Darius said softly. "At least, for a while." I looked around my small room, simple, modest, but mine. I looked at the table where I had written out my thoughts, my boundaries. "No," I said, "not right now because of Melanie." "No," I answered, "because of me." On the other end of the line, I heard him sigh. Not in protest, not in persuasion, just acceptance. "I'll try to do better," he said. "Doing better isn't about rewinding time," I said. "It's about not repeating it." We hung up. No promises, no plans, but no illusions either. A few weeks later, I moved into a smaller apartment near the lake. Nothing fancy, but full of light, quiet enough. I placed a plant on the windowsill. I hung an old photo me and Darius on his high school graduation day. I didn't hang his wedding photo. I wasn't ready. My life settled into a quieter kind of stability. I continued my role with the community fund, but I no longer let it define me. I joined a neighborhood group for middle-aged women who had lost very different things, yet carried the same kind of loneliness. Once, someone in the group asked me, "Do you regret speaking up?" I thought for a long time before answering no. I said, "I only regret staying silent for so long." I still see Darius. Not often. Not with the closeness we once had. But honestly, Melanie doesn't come with him. Maybe she isn't ready to face me as an equal. Maybe she never expected I would stand upright like this. And I accept that. One afternoon, walking along the lake, I noticed an older woman sitting alone on a stone bench. I recognized that look, the look of someone who once believed they had no one left. I thought about sitting beside her, not because I didn't care, but because I understood. Everyone has a moment when they have to stand up on their own. That night, I wrote the final lines in the notebook I had carried since my first days without a home. I wrote, "I didn't lose my family. I lost the illusion that family always means safety. And losing that illusion saved me." I closed the notebook and placed it in a drawer. Not to forget, but to remember properly. If you're listening to this story and you see yourself in it, if you've ever been pushed out of a place you thought was home, ever been asked to stay silent to keep the peace, I want to ask you one question. How long have you been silent? And if you could say one thing, just one, what would it be? Leave a comment, not to complain, but so you know you're not the only one who has stood on that edge. If this story touched you, press like, not for me, but for your own experience. And if you want to keep listening to stories about family, boundaries, and women learning how to stand upright after being pushed away, follow the channel. Because sometimes what we need most isn't a perfect ending, but a story that's real enough to remind us we still deserve a place in this world.